All right, it's time now for your business update with Solange Mougin. Hi, Solange.
Hi.
You are going to start with the announcement by Microsoft that it's going to invest heavily in artificial intelligence firm OpenAI.
Yeah, and this is not the first time that Microsoft has invested in OpenAI, which became an overnight sensation when it launched in November ChatGPT. This is a software that can create high-quality linguistic outputs such as college essays, stories, and letters. And to illustrate this, to give you an idea, colleagues and I asked it to write a poem for France 24. That was our only instructions, write a poem for France 24. And it generated in seconds the following ode to our channel. I quote, France 24, beacon of light, bringing news from day to night, from Paris to the world. It's clear your coverage is sincere. And it goes on from there. Pretty great poem. Needless to say, we writers may need to get a new job at some point soon. Microsoft says this technology can and will help it create new productivity software and boost its ability to compete with Google. Now, already in 2019, Microsoft invested $1 billion in the company. 2 years later, it doubled that investment, and now it is making the biggest bet ever. The official number has not been disclosed, but it's thought to be in the range of about $10 billion. Now, that is a lot of money coming in for a startup that lost $500 million last year. But AI says that OpenAI says that by this year, it will be profitable, and it hopes to make its first billion next year. Overall, OpenAI is seeking a valuation of $29 billion. But the timing of Microsoft's investment is also raising some eyebrows as it comes just a few days after the tech firm announced it's laying off 10,000 workers, or some 5% of its staff.
And Microsoft is actually just one of many tech firms that's decided to cut costs with massive layoffs.
Yeah, after the likes of Amazon, Microsoft, and the latest tech firm to lay off in this layoff trend is Spotify. The streaming site has announced it's cutting 6% of its global workforce, or some 600 of its nearly 10,000 employees. This comes as the tech industry on the whole adapts its spending and readjusts to what is a gloomier economic environment. Now, these shifts across the tech sector and a sense that potentially the Federal Reserve may soon slow its interest rate hikes that have been having an effect on these things have been having an effect on the markets in the past few days. But here in Europe, right now, the markets have actually pulled back a bit from the start of the day, with the FTSE CAC 40 and the DAX all in the red. This despite manufacturing indexes for January showing a return to growth in the Eurozone.
Solange, you're going to take us now to Macau, where Lunar New Year celebrations are underway.
Yeah, the streets of the Chinese peninsula and islands are bustling again, for it is the holiday season and the pandemic restrictions have also been lifted. But in this Chinese region, which is often called the Las Vegas of the East, things haven't completely returned to the mass spending that it had prior to the pandemic. And the Chinese casino hub is now wrestling with how to sustain its once vibrant livelihood in this post-COVID era. Jenny Shin has more.
Commercial streets brimming with life, and crowds posing for pictures at every turn.
It looks like a...
Tourists are back to Macau after China's U-turn on the zero-COVID policy, but it hasn't fully recovered its pre-pandemic spirit.
The atmosphere isn't as good as it was. Before, it was so crowded that people were jostling into one another. Now it's not as good as pre-pandemic. There are a bit more people, but it's not as crowded.
Before the pandemic, Macau would see nearly 40 million tourists per year at its peak. That's around 100,000 a day. Now there's only 50 to 60,000. The city is the only place in China where casinos operate legally, and for years has relied on mainland Chinese gamblers as its economic lifeline. Macau, which boasted 6 times the gaming revenue of Las Vegas pre-COVID, saw figures plunge to a record low of $5.2 billion after the government shut down most businesses at the height of a COVID wave last year. But now that COVID restrictions have turned a page, Beijing wants to diversify Macau's casino-reliant economy. President Xi Jinping has been clamping down on gambling, with the Chinese government pledging $14.9 billion on non-gaming investments, including theme parks, performance venues, and fine dining. But pivoting away from gambling and the monumental revenues it generates will be no easy feat. And the question remains whether tourists will flock to Macau not to gamble, but other things it has to offer.
Let's come back to France now, where there's a big change about for sugar beet farmers and for bees.
Yeah, the French government has decided not to seek an exemption to be able to use neonicotinoids. It's quite tricky to say, neonicotinoids, which are banned by the EU. These insecticides are widely used by sugar beet farmers to combat a virus spread by aphids. But the poison is also dubbed a bee killer. France applied a 3-year exemption in 2000 for sugar beet farmers and was expected to request another one, but then they didn't do that. It's a U-turn that came after the EU Court of Justice. It struck down such exemptions last Thursday. Instead, the government has set up a fund to help farmers until scientists manage to engineer sugar beets that are not as susceptible to the virus. Needless to say, the decision has created much angst among farmers and the sugar industry as well, but it has created much cheer from environmentalists.
Solange, we're going to wrap up now with some news that actually brings us full circle with our top business news story from Microsoft and its investment of startups.
Yeah, we're also sort of transitioning from beets and bees to burps. Bill Gates has decided to invest in a way to stop cows from burping so much. He's put some 11 million euros into an Australian firm, Ruminate, which is tackling how to lower methane coming from cows, specifically from cow burps. Surprisingly enough, it is cows' burps, and to a lesser degree their flatulence, that accounts for most of the methane that they emit. Now, curbing these bodily functions are important because methane has, over a 100-year period, it has around 30% more of a warming effect than CO2. Now, the funding from the Gates investment firm will help the company work on replicating seaweed, which has actually been shown to lower methane gases in cow burps. Such an advance could eventually transform some of the dire effects that the red meat industry has on the environment.
That's fascinating. I knew about the flatulence, to speak politely, but not about the burps.
It's actually more burps than flatulence.
Who knew? Thank you, Solange, so much for that look at today's business news on France 24. All right, here's